Last week I shared with you a story from the Old Testament about King Jehoshaphat, who was given the bad news that an army had gathered at his Judah's southern border and was about ready to launch an attack. And of course he freaked out when he heard the news, because apparently they were not equipped to be able to handle it. But what he said is, "I will seek the Lord. I don't know what to do, but my eyes are upon thee." And so this week I had the opportunity to put this principle into practice. And it's a simple thing, but I just want to kind of show you how it can work in your life, because most of our problems are fairly simple, but they don't feel simple when they're happening. So I came home one day in the afternoon, and Beth said she could not find our cat anywhere. And our cat I think she's about 7 months old now, and she's never been outside. She's a house cat. So Beth and I looked all over the house, and we were the longer we looked, the more freaked out we got, because we couldn't find Sadie. Looked in all the normal places, and she just wasn't there. And Beth said she'd gone to the store a couple of times, so I thought maybe she slipped out the door. So I went out, and Beth went out, and we looked every place outside, and we walked around the block, and I got in the car and drove around the block, and there was no Sadie anywhere. She wouldn't respond in the house any place, so I made a sign with a picture of Sadie on it. And I put it up over at the apartments across the street from us, with the hope that somebody would find her cat. And everyone I ran into, I asked if they'd seen a little gray kitten run around. Well, Beth was still out looking, and I was walking down the hall toward the kitchen in our house, and Sadie was on top of the refrigerator. She was doing a nice long stretch, and just, apparently had a great nap up on top of the cabinet or someplace. I don't know where she was. But she didn't see any problem whatsoever, other than who's yelling at me. I'm trying to sleep here. But before I walked down the hall back to the kitchen, I actually sat down and I thought of that whole story about, I'm not sure what to do here. I was feeling like we'd lost our cat. And, you just fall in love with these little animals. They're just a big part of your life, a lot more than you like to admit. And if they knew how much that was, they'd take total advantage of. So I sat down and I just thought of that verse, and thought, I don't know what to do, but my eyes are upon thee. And I got some sense of peace, and just tried to practice what I preach. And that's one of the problems with giving a talk on Sunday morning, is you often have to do what you say, and that's just not fair. You guys are supposed to do it, not me. But it's a simple thing. But so I touched that place in myself. You could say it's coincidence. You can say whatever you want, but I felt better. I even emailed Elaine. She's a cat expert, and I figured if anybody knew how to find a cat, and she had a cat story that was kind of scary. So anyway, so I exhausted all my resources, basically. But you can think how you approach almost any problem in life, and it's sort of this way. We're confronted with something we don't know how to handle. And so our first reaction is to freak out, and look at what we have in our bag of tricks to try to resolve it. My first thought was just comb the house. I was like the woman that lost the coin, and I've got 10 coins and I lost one, so I turned the house upside down, trying to find this cat. And she's just always finding new places, to hide, and I think that's intentional. I don't really know how cats think, but just always want to be out of reach, and on her terms. But we exhaust everything, and then we don't know what to do, and if we don't stop and put our eyes upon thee, then we languish in that fear, in that sense of unknowing. And it's not easy to when the problem is not resolved, to sit down and try to achieve some level of peace or the sense that things are working out. Greater good is unfolding. But where was all the drama? It was not anywhere other than in our minds, Beth and I, my minds. And then I tried to share that with Elaine, and get her involved in the drama. But that's the human side of us. And so what happens, you sit down to be still, and you find again, as I said last Sunday, your center of power. And I think I just briefly touched that, but maybe that was enough to open myself to, maybe that's what woke her up, I don't know. But that's a simple illustration, and I hope we can take these ideas and put them into places like this, into practical kinds of places, and that we do remember, you do exhaust all of your assets. You do everything you know to do first, and then that's when we usually let go, when we don't know what else to do. But that's what happens. It degrades the entire quality of our life. And I think I would feel remiss if I didn't do all those things. If I didn't look and put up a sign and do all the stuff that I did, because you would think that, well, she's probably just somewhere nearby and I could find her. So what happens is you go through that, and it destroys your peace of mind. It destroys your quality of life in that moment. And it takes a while to overcome that, to get over that. But that's how so much of life is. It's not so much what's happening as what we're doing to ourselves that really create the problem. And so it's just a lesson I guess I have not yet learned. It's a lot easier when somebody comes in to me with a problem, because then I can stand back and I can see it from a distance, and I can keep my eyes on the Lord while they're, freaked out about it. And sometimes we need that. And actually, Elaine was a good centering force. It just helped to. She said, "Oh, she went outside. She won't go too far," and all of that kind of thing. And that was reassuring. So sometimes we do need to reach out to get that reminder that it's going to be all right. And I act like this is a big crisis, but it's if you've got a pet, you know what that's like. I've lost many pets through my life, and it's just not a pleasant experience. It's why I was so reluctant to get one now. It's just one of the hardest things to go through, is to lose a pet. But part of me thought we had lost her, but we had not. And so that's what we have to look at. Look at that energy, that's really churning up inside and just destroying anything that looks like peace. We want the world to be peaceful, but are we willing to let go long enough to experience that peace? That was my lesson for that week. So today we're looking at the mystical union, and this kind of ties into what I want to talk about today. Jesus said, "Have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder." And I did a little research. I've performed somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 weddings over my life, and statistics show about half those would be still going. I don't really know, but we can look at this saying in a couple of ways. We can look at it literally as a commentary on marriage, and that's the way it usually is looked at. It's like Jesus laying down the law. It's like, you leave your father and mother, and husband and wife become one, and you never put that asunder because God has joined it together. So a lesson that probably was being conveyed there from Matthew is literally when a man declared a divorce, and in that culture, that's what you could do. A man wakes up one day and says, "I don't want to be married anymore," and he declares a divorce. And so he can go on and, live his life, but the woman is in a very different situation. She may have to resort to prostitution in order to make a living. And it's a pretty traumatic thing. And so Jesus may have been addressing that. Don't just blow off your responsibilities that easy. There's a life involved here. But I think that's one way to look at it. And it's what's interesting to me is I was doing I researched a little bit the statistics on divorce, and it doesn't appear that the Christian community has any less of a divorce rate than anyone else. It's all pretty much the same. And I don't think really that this is a commentary on marriage and divorce. What I think, now maybe that's how Matthew used it, and we're making a distinction between the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the Gospel of Jesus. So I think maybe Matthew was using this statement as commentary on the institution of marriage and maybe to keep it going better. But what's interesting here, too, in this, I'll get to another section here. What Jesus does here, he speaks in contrasting terms. And he often does this. He uses things like good and bad fish, wheat and tares, wide and narrow gates, old and new wine, houses built on rock and sand, male and female, just to name a few. We get the most from these illustrations when we see them not as references to believers and sinners, but as contrasting elements of consciousness. And I think that's how we can get the most out of this saying today about marriage. We're not talking about marriage of people, we're talking about marriage of the forces of our own being, bringing those together. And we'll explain what that means in a moment. The interesting thing about Jesus' reference to the Old Testament, to Genesis, is probably this line. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. There's been a lot of controversy about this statement. We've tried to talk about God as he. In fact, that's the culture it came out of, is a very masculine culture. And so we've tended to use that. And then we've used God as she. But in Genesis, we see that God is male and female, which is something we don't really get. The use of the word man here is a generic overall humankind. That's how it's used. But to say that man, or all of us, are created in the image of God, male and female, is God, male and female. So we get involved in this whole gender thing that's quite confusing. But if you think of male and female not as gender, think of it as two elements that we all have within us, a masculine and feminine. The male being the intellect, the sensus-oriented self, which is what we use most of the time. And then we have the female, which is the intuitive or soul-oriented. So we look at the individual as one who, we're going through life where we are spiritual beings, but normally we live in the head. We live in the intellect. It's a male-only world, and I'm talking about women and men, that we tend to judge by appearances, as I did in my little episode earlier this week. We look at the facts, and we respond to those. It was when I sat down and said, my eyes are upon thee. That's when I opened my feminine side, my intuitive side, somewhat. So we try to solve the problems with our head, and sometimes we need to back off and let the inspiration of the heart come forward. And this is the type of marriage that we are talking about. What God puts together in this sense, no condition can put asunder. That is, once you touch that center of power, as I talked about last week, when you touch that, it changes the whole way you think. And this is the whole Christmas story with Mary and Joseph. Mary being the soul or the intuitive side, Joseph being the masculine intellect. That the announcement is made of Jesus' birth when Joseph is asleep. And that's laying the intellectual side of us aside, not getting rid of it. Because our intellect provides a fabulous interface with our three-dimensional world. We're all going to leave here, we're going to get in our cars and drive off. And that's there's a lot of intellectual activity that takes place in that. If you don't think that's true, if you lose your memory, somewhat of your memory, and you forget, how to put your keys in your ignition and turn it on, that's an intellectual thing. You don't want to lose that. The intellect plays a very important part in dealing with this material world. So it's not an either or, but it's the intuition, the intuitive side that's where the announcement is made. That's where the birth occurs, through the soul. And we understand that by how we feel. Think of your own spiritual journey. As I've asked before, what is it that pushed you beyond your normal thinking? What is it that pushed you beyond the tradition that you grew up in? I've been doing some research on Google Earth, just looking at places I have lived in the past. It's pretty fascinating to be able to find those. But I went to the church where I was baptized. It's been totally redone in this little town of Gower, Missouri, where I was immersed. But that's where I began to get my training or my thought. I guess in a Christian-based culture, we're born into it. You get it from day one. You're taught this whole system of Jesus and God and all of the sin and salvation, all of that stuff. It just kind of through osmosis, you kind of pick it up. But it's interesting to go back there and to kind of think, just with a picture, which is an intellectual activity, but it stirs the soul. And I thought, what is it that pushed me from that path, from believing in that, which was the authority that I was given, to another thing that, there was really no authority in my life at that time. I found the library where I found the book Lessons in Truth, and it just kind of brings back a whole flood of memories. But if I had not walked through that door, and that door represents an intellectual facility, books, reading, ideas. So I'm glad that we have an intellect. I'm glad we have that level in us. But what happens when you open a book that's covered with words, each page is covered with words, and you read those words and they do something different? They have a different impact on you. What is that? It's not something that comes out of the book, because you can take that book and you can hand it to somebody else and say, read this, it'll light you up. And they'll read it, bring it back as my minister did, and say it's a work of the devil. Have the exact opposite effect. So it's not in the intellect. My birth did not occur in the pages of that book. It's what stirs, what those pages stir. That's my soul. That's my intuitive side. How is it that we can read something and feel it's true even when, there's no precedent for it in our life? I've thought about that so many times, because what would give me the courage, what would give me the incentive to pursue something that had no precedent anyplace else in my experience? And that's the intuitive side. That's the soul pushing out always. And I think for most people in this society that we live in, we're very gadget-oriented. We're very technologically oriented. We talk about evolution. We talk about the evolving technological side, and it's very fascinating. And I like that side. But we're losing touch with that deeper reality. When people talk about software and say it's intuitive. We're not talking about the same thing. There's nothing intuitive about software. I don't care what they say. It's just they're trying to sell something. It's a very intellectual thing. You may stumble across an answer that you're looking for with a new software program, but would never, ever consider it intuitive. Like you just sit down and suddenly you know how to do. It's not that. That's not it. It doesn't work that way at all. It never has for me. Maybe it does for you, but it doesn't for me. And I know it doesn't for the hours I've spent on the phone with family members and stuff that are absolutely non-intuitive, counterintuitive. So we're not talking about the same thing. We're kind of prostituting this word, intuition. But we all know it. That's the thing, and yet it's getting drowned out. It's like I'm not quite happy with life. I'm not quite satisfied. What is that? So we stop looking inside. We stop looking within. We have divorced the soul, basically. God has joined it together, but we put it asunder because we put more emphasis on the external aspect of life, and we don't pay attention to this unrest that we feel. And that unrest is the soul pushing out, saying there's more to you than you realize. And it's a very interesting thing, but we tend to maybe think of that as negative. I'm unhappy because my cell phone's outdated or something like that. It's like if I get a new cell phone, then I'll be happy. Well, I've gotten several new cell phones, and I'm no happier really. There's some convenience about them, but there's also, they'll drive you crazy, so what do you want? You can go either way with it. But Emily Cady said, the person that really changed my life, intuition and intellect are meant to travel together, but intuition always holding the reins to guide intellect. Toward my final years with Unity, they began to say, Katie said that, but it's really the intellect that we want to develop. They made a whole different change in how this was to be approached. And they started turning toward intellectual education, about getting, to the latest, greatest software and all the innovations that were happening. So when the intellect was being raised up, the soul was dying. And when I got into it, it was exactly the opposite. This is what I got into. It was somebody telling me that it's your intuition. And I, back then, even had thought, it's the head, study, read, ask questions. And I didn't really understand this unrest that I felt, that was my soul. And the intuition is the voice of the soul. It's pushing up through me, pushing up through you. And so we try to satisfy that pushing up rather than acknowledge it. And that's what I loved about what I read here from Katie. It made me think about, I'm not letting my intuition control. It's my intellect. I'm trying to figure all this stuff out. And I'm not listening. I'm listening, but I don't know. I'm kind of groping in the dark. That's what it amounts to. But the time comes when you stop groping in the dark. You start acknowledging that this thing that is pushing out through you is definitely your spiritual dimension. So we're no longer two but one flesh, our head and heart joined in spiritual matrimony. And I thought about walking through those doors. In fact, I told Audrey when I was looking at the picture on my computer in my desk back there, and said if I hadn't walked through those doors, we wouldn't be here right now. This is like one of those moments in life that you come to a Y in the road and you take a right when you normally would have taken a left. And you don't know when those things are going to happen. But my response to what I read in that book was not a head trip. It was a heart trip. It was a soul trip, an intuitive prompting. And that's what I have followed ever since. And sometimes my head will say, go this way, but I listen and I pray and I think about it. And really that's what prayer is, or one way to think of it, is listen to your feelings. What are they saying? I had an opportunity to leave here some years ago and spoke in a church, and nothing about it felt right. And it looked good from an intellectual point of view. The whole situation looked good, but it didn't feel right. And I think I'm here now, even with our little group here. It's all come to this, and there's a reason for it. And I think, what would I change if I went back? What would I erase? What road would I take instead of the one I did? And I have to think every choice I made since I've been in the ministry, and probably before, has been based on the intuitive prompting. I've had several opportunities in my life to go for big churches and things that look very appealing, and it's kind of like Wayne Dyer gave an illustration one time about being late for something. You're driving down the road and there's a traffic jam and you're late and you're all upset. But he says if you would have gone at the normal time, you may have been the one that had the wreck. Just if you would have been there 5 seconds later, you might have been the one that was in the wreck. So maybe that was a way to keep you safe, a way to keep you. It's an interesting thought. But the head is not always right. And so often it will get us in trouble, the intellect. I'm late. I got to get there, do everything I can to get there quickly. I've done that many times. You go have a meeting with somebody running a little bit late, and you get all hyped up. You get there and they're not there. All that for nothing. But it's what we're trying to achieve here is a trust in that prompting, that deepest prompting, that doesn't always go with the head, but the head must listen. The intellect must listen. And when it does, I think it's better. At least you can look at yourself in the mirror. Our intellectually driven science sees the soul as little more than a neurological process, an accidental byproduct of physical processes. The towering intellect has effectively divorced this intuitive counterpart for the lure of technology. You will see this primarily when you get into studies of consciousness and things like near-death experience, and where we're looking at consciousness. We're looking at, is it possible for the soul to separate from the body and remain alive? When you get into science's approach to that question, they say no. General science says no, that doesn't happen. There can be nothing that exists outside of the body. And so science is basically in charge. As I said, that's our high priesthood today. We're looking at science for answers, more so than to religion, I think, overall. So we have divorced the soul. We've divorced the intuitive side. And yet, someone like Einstein, he really talked about the importance of intuition. And he considered himself very intuitive. And scientists that read his comments on intuition, he didn't mean that. He meant something else. But I think he meant what he said. I think he was a very intuitive person who let his intuition teach his intellect and came up with some pretty brilliant things. It's what we grasp as our center that determines which direction we go through life. Through all time, this mystical union that God has joined together is truly a marriage that no culture can afford to put asunder. Every civilization we have seen come and go has deteriorated from within. It depends on what they have put up as their, collectively, as their God. And how would we describe our society today? What is our God today? What are we all trying to go after? It's pretty confusing. It's pretty hard to put your finger on it, but it's relatively safe to say it's not God. It's not necessarily an understanding of ourselves as spiritual beings, although there's a lot of spiritual movements in the country and all. But the interest is in technology, it's in education, it's in the intellectual side of life. We're seeing this with this college scandal thing, which is pretty incredible. That you don't have to be smart. All you have to do is get the credential, and that's all you have to do. because everybody then believes if you have a degree from Harvard, then you must be pretty smart, whether you are or not. It's just kind of and as somebody was pointing out, you talk about Ted Bundy, the mass murderer, he was a graduate from Harvard. Well, so we thought, well, he's a smart mass murderer, just there's something that puts him in a different category. But it's all a label, and that's intellectual stuff. And it's like in that particular world, there are a lot of people who they're very well educated, but they're not too smart. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing this play out. They've been busted. And it's been going on forever. But all you got to do is get the credential. That's good enough in the society. So what does that say about the society? It says a lot about the people that are doing it, but what does it say about the rest of us? Where's our God? That's what we're having to look at. So I think these kinds of things, as ugly as they can be, they serve a purpose. They cause us to start taking a look at ourselves again. It said of Jesus, they were all blown away by him because he had no learning. He had no formal education. And yet he could outmaneuver the Pharisees and scribes, the lawyers, all the people of spiritual doctrine of his day. And because he was intuitive. He was coming from a deeper level, and that allowed him to see this intellectual, scriptural side in a completely different way, which is what we're doing here with this series. So learn to discern the difference between impulses from the head and the heart. And the impulses from the heart may be and probably will show up as discomfort of some kind, unrest. That's at least the way I have experienced it. And the head says, well, I don't like that feeling. I want to get rid of it. So I go out and try to address that in some way. But to sit down, to say, I don't know what to do here, but my eyes are upon thee. And in this case, what is that unrest? It's the acknowledgement that there's something greater pushing out through me. And that something will teach the head, it'll teach the intellect. Just as when Joseph went to sleep, he had this awakening. He awoke in his sleep, within his sleep, had this experience. So there's a greater something unfolding here, not like the head says. You are a spiritual being with an intellectual faculty. That's a very important thing. The intellect is our interface with this stuff. And it's a very important one. We don't want to deny it. We don't want to put it down. But we don't want to make it our God. As Katie said, we want to put the intellect in the back seat and listen to the intuition. And by intuition, we're not talking about emotion. People mistake that. And when you see a lot of the born-again Christian stuff, it's very emotional. And I put very little credence in that. I've seen people born again, they're all excited, but it's a very short-lived thing. It's better to feel a long-term unrest and acknowledge that it is a greater dimension in you, your soul working out into a greater degree. But your intellect is a tool that you use. It's a very important one. And it's important to say that we pursue the things we value most. Look at our society. Don't look too long. Look at your own life. But if you said, what does our society value most? What you think it'd be God? You think it'd be the intuitive side? You think it'd be the soul? It doesn't look like it. And I don't know what's in everybody's heart, of course. I'm just going by what we see on an external level. It's pretty chaotic at the moment, but it'll change. It always does. We all come back. Everything takes its turn and comes back, and it's a good thing. Okay, I'm not going to be here next week. I'm going to have a hernia repaired in the morning, and Elaine is going to speak for me. I'm a real amateur at this. I've never done this, so I talk to you guys, and I've had a gallbladder out, I've had this done, I've had that done, so I'm a total amateur at this. So just keep me in your thoughts if you're awake at 6:30 in the morning. I won't be, hopefully. But, pardon?
Tomorrow?
Yeah, tomorrow. Don't come visit me. I don't want that. But just keep me in your thoughts, and as I do you every time one of you go through something like this. Okay, we'll see you in 2 weeks, but show up and support Elaine. She's going to have something really good to say. She'll know it when...
You've been watching a talk presented at the Unity Church of Grand Junction by Reverend Doug Bottorff. We would like to thank everyone who joined us here today in beautiful Grand Junction, Colorado, as well as those of you who are joining us online. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. Also, please feel free to share this video with anyone you think might be interested or benefit from this message. If this video brought value to your life, please consider making a donation by clicking the link below to our PayPal donation account. Thanks again so much for watching.